Washington's approach to diplomacy in Africa is undergoing a significant transformation.
It's the first time we started seeing the smoke signal that this is a key area for the U.S. government.
In December 2022, the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit launched the Digital Transformation with Africa Initiative, a sweeping effort to expand digital access and literacy across the continent.
It's really, really wonderful to see the U.S. government modernizing its approach to investment and trade on the continent.
But this might not just be about bringing internet access to underserved communities, but also an attempt to counterbalance China's growing technological influence in Africa.
We see the Chinese system as a state-centric system versus the US, which is largely a private sector-driven, investment-driven model.
So finding the best way to engage with different partners is important.
So what's been accomplished since the initiative launched? How do African countries view this new approach?
What does it mean for the widening digital divide across the continent for those who already feel left behind? How do we make sure that it's more inclusive?
And what's at stake as the US and China compete for technological supremacy on the continent? This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today we're joined by Rob Floyd, Pren-Tsilya Boa-Guehe, and Dr. Jane Munga. Dr. Munga is a fellow in the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Rob Floyd is Director for Innovation and Digital Policy at the African Center for Economic Transformation. And Pren-Tsilya Boa-Guehe is Google's head for Pan-African Institutions, Government Affairs, and Public Policy. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggett, President of Network 2020.
Welcome to the three of you. We are in very good hands today. And so with that, what I wanted to do is just start off our conversation where I usually like to start with a bit of a primer. And so Jane, if I may, I'd like to start with you. The premise behind this talk: digital technologies are set to shape the world's economy, including African economies. And within this context, the United States launched the Digital Transformation with Africa during the 2022 U.S.-Africa Summit to advance this digital collaboration. So could you please give us basically the Cliff Notes version of the DTA? What is it within U.S.-Africa relations? How significant is the initiative? And what does it tell us about Washington's relationship with the continent at the moment?
Thank you, Courtney, for putting this together, and definitely for having us here to discuss this. So thank you for this opportunity, and really happy to be part of this discussion. So the Cliff Note version of the DTA, I have spent some time researching this, so I'll try and be as concise as possible. In your introductory remarks, you say that tech has a potential to shape the Africa scene, and I think that is very precise with the undertone or the driver for DTA. And also just to say is that tech is already shaping the African ecosystem. We're already seeing a huge digital transformation. So the DTA came on board as a strategic initiative to carry forward first the US government's policy on Africa, which they had launched the year before, the DTA, and that's the US Sub-Saharan Strategy on Africa, where they outline a broad perspective of how they're approaching the African continent. And in one of those documents, they talked about digital transformation itself. It's the first time we started seeing the smoke signal that this is a key area for the U.S. government. And they talked about connectivity and talked about digital capacities, and also talked about the enabling environment, which then became the three anchor areas for the digital transformation with Africa. So the DTA is a Biden, as you said, is a Biden initiative. It targets a collaboration, a very targeted collaboration with African countries. It's key to note that it is the entire African continent, even though it's anchored within the Sub-Saharan African strategy. So it targets all the African countries, in these three areas that I mentioned of the digital economy and infrastructure, the human capital, and the enabling environment. And it also comes with some key things, factors that I think are very crucial to note. First and foremost, it has a huge financial commitment. And I think this was a very big difference because it came with 350 grants, and then it was also committing Congress to raise about 450. So if you look at that, that's a big figure for financing just for tech within African countries. Secondly, DTA commits to bring all the different US agencies on board, and they put together a committee that for each of the three pillars that is headed by different areas of government. I think it's important to know that tech is being promoted or is being undertaken by different areas of agencies. So DTA brought that umbrella body to help it in its agenda. And then now let's look at the other side, the African side, because it's always good to see how this intersects from the African continent. The document itself was very clear. It was also trying to see how to support Africans. And Africans have already underlined this within the the Union's digital transformation strategy. This is a key document that African countries have already signed, adopted, and are already rolling out. It doesn't mean that African countries are also not doing their own digital transformation strategies, as most countries have their own policies and have their own targets, but they do tie into this. And within the strategy itself, African countries were very clear that they wanted to have an inclusive digital society and economy, and to ensure that all Africans are able to benefit from this. And one of the key areas that was key was to ensure that everybody has connectivity. And so you can see the connection points. Now, the third thing on this cliff notes, as I try and also wind up, is to also note that there's always the geopolitics of these issues, and it also helps to support both political interests from the US side and also from African countries. For those African countries still have a variety of partners to work in. There are key countries that have also targeted DTA as one of their anchor foreign policy objectives. And we begin to see that even as the USAID is beginning and other agencies are beginning to roll this out, they have targeted some countries in the first year, the second year, and to ensure this. So the US government has been, in the past few decades, been also very strong in ensuring that there is partnership that is based on common and shared values and platforms to ensure that the internet economy connectivity is open and free and fair, and what we call trusted partners. So the DTA also comes to support that, and it also targets to ensure that it is generating a shared ecosystem, digital ecosystem within these principles for both the US and within the African countries. So when I talk about the geopolitics, also there are other variables that are happening, the influence of the East on the African continent. So there's also trying to rebalance this around this initiative. But it's also important to note that the DTA was extremely framed to ensure that it is surfacing the interests of Africans and not more so the geopolitics of it, because it is to ensure that there's prosperity between these two continents and how they integrate on the tech side. Last but not least, it's also to say that DTA now is its in third year, and it's been a presidential initiative. There's also been signals that it needs to continue on because we continue to see some of the initiatives rolling out. But we can discuss that later. But for now, it's just to show that this is definitely one of the key US government initiatives, a strong foreign policy signal to show that the US is very keen on collaborating on tech when it comes to the African continent. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Jane. That was a terrific overview. Rob, what does the current digital transformation landscape in Africa look like? What are some of the challenges and opportunities, and how does DTA fit into this context of what Jane said? There are a lot of things that are already happening. How does DTA fit into the current landscape as you would see it?
Thanks, Courtney, and thanks for inviting me. The current landscape is mixed, but very fast moving, right? So we've seen a big growth of digital companies, particularly in fintech and now in AI, very rapid adoption of mobile platforms, great ecosystems of entrepreneurs and innovators, and significant but not sufficient investment in digital infrastructure and digital public goods. At the continental level, Jane mentioned the African Union Digital Transformation Strategy, which is the overall framework for digital transformation. But it's important to note that the AU also has a data policy framework that guides all 54 countries. Recently, the AI roadmap and white paper were introduced that will eventually become an AI framework or AI policy. And then, of course, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement has the digital trade protocols as well. So from a continental perspective, it's actually given the relative youth of the African Union and the newness of this topic. I think that the continent is moving apace. At the country level, it is more of a mixed picture. Some countries are certainly embracing digital transformation, while others are, to be honest, are falling behind, particularly as we move into areas such as AI. The same is true on the private sector side. Some governments have incentivized the digital economy, while others have done less so. And of course, from an investment perspective, some companies have got much larger investments, particularly from the big tech in China, US, Europe, and so on. And I would say the kind of similar view of the ecosystems for innovation and entrepreneurship. We see very, very active ecosystems in some countries, and in some less so. I mean, part of this is due to market size, which thwarts that ecosystem in some countries, but also due to the business environment, instability in some places, lack of operability, and so forth. I mean, where the DTA has a role to play, I think it's one lever in this transformation journey. I mean, if we look at something like connectivity, in Morocco, 90% of citizens use the internet, but in 36 other African countries, it's below 50%. And this includes in some big economies such as Nigeria, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivoire. Similarly, if we look at digital skills, Egypt has the largest share of STEM fields in the workforce at about 6.5%, but that's the highest. I mean, even South Africa is at 5.7% of STEM in the workforce. Policy development, I don't like the term, but capacity building. Digital policy is in many senses new policy. It's unlike developing a policy in agriculture or health or education that the policymakers have done for decades and decades. A data protection or cyber or AI policy has never been done before in these countries. So they need lots of capacity building in that sense. Same thing on investment in digital infrastructure. I mean, we have to remember that more than half of the countries in Africa have not recovered their GDP since the pandemic. They're also facing higher debts, and so the incentives for that investment are much more difficult. And of course, there's a Africa risk premium for investment in Africa for financing, which is probably not fair, but it's the world in which we live. And then basic infrastructure, things like power. In Ghana, where Asset is based, we were facing load shedding. Of course, South Africa has had load shedding for ages. And the World Bank estimates that by 2030, 500 million people in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, will be without access to power. So all this to say that a lot is happening, but the challenges are still great. And the DTA is one lever to help address those.
Wonderful. Thank you. There are some dogs barking in the background, just as full disclosure. Pren-Tsilya, just to follow on Rob's answer about the digital landscape, the work that you're doing at Google has been working with a lot of stakeholders on the ground to fast track connectivity. Could you talk about some of those leapfrogging technologies that you're working with and what the impact of that leapfrogging might be in some of the most rapidly growing places?
Yes, for sure. And I think the dogs are barking in agreement. Yes. They're echoing support for the DTA initiative, which we in the private sector were all very eager and excited about. Honestly, it was a really renewed and reinvigorated approach to foreign policy with the African continent. And as a former Foreign Service officer, U.S. Foreign Service officer who was also African, it's really, really wonderful to see the U.S. government modernizing its approach to investment and trade on the continent, and leveraging digital as a pillar of this policy was really, really critical and timely. I think Rob mentioned a lot of the ongoing initiatives on the continent, right? So African governments are already thinking about how do we leverage technology as an enabler of development, and as a pillar of economic growth. And so it's wonderful that the U.S. is now aligning with this initiative. On our end, we were also consulted during the process of the DTA development. We attended the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit where it was unveiled. And really the pillars align with our investment objectives for the continent as well. The pillars around human capital development, around infrastructure, around regulatory enablement were really, really key, right? And so we announced our Equiano subsea cable, which connects Portugal all the way down to West Africa. And then recently we announced our Umoja subsea cable for East Africa. Recently, just a few months ago, actually, as Kenya's President Ruto visited the United States. And so what it has done is it has ignited, right, a different sense of energy and an interest in investment on the continent, which is really, really pivotal and timely. We also announced our very first cloud region on the continent, which is going to enable greater and faster internet adoption and penetration across Africa, and the modernization of government services. And we're not the only ones, right? So our peers and competitors are also doing the same, which I think is really, really wonderful. When the DTA initiative was unveiled, though, I don't think AI was a critical component of the strategy, right? Because it focused on infrastructure, the human capital development, and the regulatory enablement. ChatGPT was just coming out. And so the world had not yet understood the potential of AI, and that it would be such a revolutionary product that was accessible to the public so quickly, right? And so what we have learned since the launch of this initiative is that AI has to be a critical component of any government strategy with the continent. And the continent itself sees this with the AI strategy that Rob just mentioned, right? So just a few weeks ago, the African Union adopted an AI strategy. And I know you said that, many African governments don't know about it, but my counterparts who work in the EU have similar challenges. AI is new globally. It's really nascent across the globe. And so it's something that we are all trying to become more familiar with and to understand the economic potential and the risks as well. And so when we look at the potential for the continent, we just did an assessment and put out a white paper about this. For Ghana, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, we forecast and foresee about $136 billion in potential gains from AI applications by 2030. And that's really critical when we're looking at how do we grow Africa's GDP, and that's just in 4 countries. So we know that the potential is massive, right? But we're also concerned about the risks. What does it mean for the widening digital divide across the continent for those who already feel left behind? How do we make sure that it's more inclusive, right? And how do we bring people along? How do we make sure that there's not a lot of job displacement? What we know so far is that probably more developed countries will suffer from that than developing economies will. So that means that we need to do more skilling and education around AI and the potential that AI has to be integrated in people's daily lives. And then how do we use it to solve regular problems that we're facing on the continent so that Africa is not on the global stage always being discussed as an aid case or, for crises, but how do we use this technology as a solution to address some of these issues? And so you asked me about, what are we seeing in terms of leapfrog leapfrogging technology. We're seeing amazing, phenomenal technology around flood forecasting that shows and can predict when a flood is coming and alert people and humanitarian aid agencies to prepare and to learn and how to assess how to distribute humanitarian assistance. We saw this happening in Kenya a few months ago, which is where I live. And so it's wonderful to see technology that is delivered that actually makes a difference and has an impact. We're also seeing technology that is important for agriculture, right? Jane was talking about agriculture previously, but we still have a lot of agrarian-based economies across the continent. And so now we're looking at how do we leverage technology to predict which crops will be most beneficial to farmers and how weather will impact the growth of certain crops, right? So that they can adjust and adapt their strategies in terms of what they're growing and how they're treating their crops and be able to have more opportunities. And then on health, we're developing some technologies working with local partners to make sure that we're providing healthcare assistance in underserved areas, especially in rural areas that are sometimes more removed from healthcare facilities. And so it's wonderful to see technology being used in life-saving ways on the agriculture front, on sustainability, for climate change issues. There's really a range. And Africa is already using AI. AI exists. It's here on the continent. It's still new, right, for everybody globally, and also here. And so, what we're really trying to see is how do we partner with governments and how can the U.S. be a helpful agent in these conversations so that we can have constructive dialogues with African governments, civil society, educational institutions, so that we're bringing everyone along in this journey. Thank you.
Fantastic. It sounds like there's so much happening. Rob, I'd like to turn a little bit now to the geopolitical context. Obviously, China has been a big player in terms of investment in Africa. But I'd love just to zoom out a little bit and get your sense of how geopolitical trends are manifesting on the ground. And it might be, what distinguishes the attention from China and the U.S. across the continent, but maybe in the U.S. we're just so focused on U.S.-China, maybe it's something else entirely. So what are some of the significant geopolitical echoes that you're seeing when it comes to the digital landscape across the continent?
Thanks. I guess I see a number of models globally, some of which are being promoted in Africa to different degrees. And of course, that creates certain tensions or certain stresses to the system as policymakers are trying to determine what the best thing to do, right? You mentioned China. So, we see the Chinese system as a state-centric system, right? State-owned enterprises intervening, somewhat directed, et cetera, versus the U.S., which is largely a private sector-driven, investment-driven model. The EU model, I would say, sitting on the continent. The EU is the European Union is putting lots of energy and resources behind digital transformation and its relationship with the continent. And there it's a human-centric model, as they call it, but one really about protecting citizens, right? Now that comes with certain restrictions as well, and I'll speak to that in a second. And then, there's a new model that isn't being promoted as much in Africa necessarily, and that's the Indian model, which is really around digital public goods and inclusive services and so forth, which many of us think is in some ways maybe a better model for Africa given the digital divide. But all three of those first ones are competing with different offerings, money, technology, security arrangements, et cetera, and different incentives, right? And so that puts policymakers and leaders sometimes in a difficult situation of what to do, and also means that sometimes policy becomes muddled. And I'll give you an example here. So the Africa Union Digital Transformation Strategy is crystal clear that data should be able to move across borders in Africa. Otherwise, you cannot have a single digital market. You can't have a single market if you don't have data that can cross from Ghana to Togo or from Rwanda to Kenya. At the same time, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, the famous GDPR, has quite severe restrictions on data flow. Some African governments are now putting in data localization law that's restricting the flow of data so they can be in line with the GDPR. And so that simply will mean that the investment environment is not as good. It means that companies won't be able to trade across borders as easily, but it also affects, research and international development projects and all kinds of things, right? So those are the types of muddling that we see because of these geopolitical, not necessarily tensions, but different perspectives, right? And then there's, of course, other consequences that are more geopolitical. So the United States bans 5 Chinese tech companies, governments in Africa that are working with those tech companies that have that technology. Then what does that mean for American companies and relationships between even, the African government and U.S. agencies that are working in the country, et cetera. Pren-Tsilya mentioned the submarine cables. Here's another, and I think looking, to the future and what geopolitics, the impact it might have, right? Recently, we've had a couple of instances where submarine cables were cut or malfunctioned, and huge swaths of particularly West and Southern Africa were in internet hell. And, it took a long time to get everyone back up to full speed. But also that just highlighted the vulnerability that 54 countries that have relatively few undersea cable connections, how vulnerable they might be. And the same could apply to data storage, to cloud computing, of course, to cyber, et cetera. So I think, policymakers are not, they recognize the specific maybe U.S.-China relationship, but it's much broader and much deeper than that, of all of the geopolitical factors that they have to take into account as they address these issues.
Thank you. That's eye-opening. I appreciate that. Jane, kind of jumping off of that with all of these different types of policies coming in, DTA, different kinds of investment. What are some of the perspectives that you're hearing from African governments about the DTA and its accomplishments so far? And where are there gaps that they hope to address?
Thank you for that question, Courtney. And I want you just to comment on very insightful. I love the way Rob captured that, different modeling of different issues, depending on the different players. He mentioned especially the issue of data. I think now there's a term that I keep hearing. I even saw a paper published on the Brussels effect, which I found was very interesting. It's the norms that these players are bringing onto the table tend to influence the outcomes that have been expected within these foreign policy initiatives. And so it goes to my first comment on this question, is that what are we hearing, or what do we see African leaders, because they have started becoming vocal and giving their feedback on this. And a lot of leadership within African countries are saying that these are all different foreign policy opportunities. And so for them, the sovereignty issue is very important, that they still have agency in choice of partners. So that even as they engage with the different players, there's still opportunity not to just engage with the US, but also there's room to engage with China, to engage with the EU, despite some of the geopolitics that are at play. So for a lot of African countries, even when we look at the numbers, there's still a lot of investment that is being done by other players continentally. Pren-Tsilya put a very interesting phrase that I hope I can capture the way she said it. Some of her competitors or something, and then there's those who they align with. I don't remember the word, but anyway, it's to show that this, even within the business circles, there are those that you tend to align with it, and also you consider your competitors in the space. And within the geopolitical sphere, for African countries, the leadership is very clear that they want to keep the autonomy of choice, despite what is being surfaced to them. And it's then up to them to decide what's best, because the issues is what were highlighted here earlier. There's the issue of skills, the issue of connectivity that was broken down. A lot of countries, even those that are already leading in tech, are still not connected, and the potential for socioeconomic development comes from so many opportunities. And I don't think there's only one partnership who is able even to meet the need. So finding the best way to engage with different partners is important. Secondly, at Carnegie last year in December, we held a 1-year review of what we called the US-Africa Partnership. And it was a very enlightening event. We had a lot of stakeholders, especially those that came from the African continent, express the need to be involved. So being in the 1 year, I don't know if it's fair to say that we have yet to really grasp the full involvement in this, but what it is there's still a desire for more and more, not just governments themselves, because governments are involving themselves through bilaterals, but even for the private sector that is based within these African countries. So even as the partnerships are being done by government, that the partnerships are also being matched within the private sectors that are there. And there's a lot of initiatives also happening within the US chambers that is trying to make sure that these connections are happening. So there's a need for not just the bigger companies that are involved in the tech space, but even for the entrepreneurs and those who are entering the space to see how they can gain either way. The third thing that has come very strongly is the regulatory side. There's still a lot of barriers when we talk about digital economy, especially for products to flow between the African continent and the US and vice versa. So there's a lot of conversations that have begun to happen, even within the DTA itself, within its third pillar, to ensure that some of the regulatory barriers are being dealt with or are being resolved. Either it's even not just with the flow of data or digital products, but even the flow with people. So the digital economic ecosystem is so vast that it encompasses the goods themselves, the people, the movement. So there is also a demand signal showing that we need to also start looking at those ecosystems. But within our first year review, we saw a lot of projects that were looking at connectivity. And this is key because it's what a lot of African countries have been saying. They want to connect their citizens. So there's a need to continue that, not just to ensure that you get a signal or you're able to connect to the internet, but then also to take this to the next step. How do you ensure that then people are connected? Because a lot of people have the availability of service, but they can't afford it. So going bigger into other initiatives that looks at the regulatory ecosystem that is probably prohibitive because of cost and prices that drives this up. And other socioeconomic factors, that is one of the areas that really needs to be addressed even within the GTA or any other digital collaboration with that. And lastly is also that came up very clearly was also the issue of young people. Young African talent is very tech savvy. They see these digital collaborations as an opportunity for growth, for socioeconomic employment, to ensure they have jobs and to also grow their ideas. So the DTA, I think, can and it also has the angle of ensuring inclusivity. But the young people have been very vocal in seeing how do we benefit from this? What is that linkage that it is there for me as a young person to ensure that these initiatives are not just benefiting the governments, but also that trickles down to them. If we look at technology today, at what's happening at, I don't know if Pren-Tsilya is still in Nairobi, but look at what's happening in Kenya. The demonstrations for change are being driven by young people and tech. So the intersection of tech and young people continues to be a factor that any initiative globally when it comes to Africa has to be considered. How do you get young people more engaged? And how do you then ensure technologies that are accelerant that to ensure that they are benefiting from the digital collaboration? But thanks for the question and back to you.
Terrific, thank you. And just to follow up, Jane, You mentioned the Brussels effect, and Rob was also talking about this fragmentation of the way different powers are looking at technology and regulation. So the Brussels effect, we had Anu Bradford spoke to us. She's the author, and Digital Empires describes what Rob was describing earlier, her book, and it's excellent, just as a mention for those who might be interested in learning more about that. Pren-Tsilya, the private sector is playing a big role, as Google's work shows. What is your assessment of the overall private sector involvement in the continent? What is interest like? How is attention being distributed across the continent? And how do initiatives like DTA, do they have any impact on the private sector's decisions to make an undersea cable or have some of these initiatives? So what is the relationship between initiatives that come from Washington and what the private sector is doing?
Well, thank you so much. And the Brussels effect is definitely real. As someone who's working here with many African governments and the Pan-African institutions, you can certainly see it. I won't say that it's necessarily negative, right? We want governments to be able to share best practices and exchange knowledge. I think what's important is for African leaders to decide what is best for Africa's growth and for its agenda to transform digitally, right? And so does it always make sense to replicate what is being done? I don't even think that's the intention of the EU, right? It's to share what's being done and then for that to either be adapted or so you take some from that applies to you and you leave the rest. And so it's really important that we have these sorts of critical conversations about what is best for the continent so that the continent could decide how to center African voices in determining what the future of technology will look like and how Africa can be centered, right, in innovation that is exported globally. And then you asked about the impact for the private sector, and the private sector is not just us. Google is a great player. We think we're doing some really solid work in the digital ecosystem. We're based in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, and Ghana, where we have our AI research center. But we're not the only ones, right? And the digital ecosystem, the biggest portion of it is actually the small and medium businesses that use and leverage the internet to create business opportunities. And Africa's digital economy, the SMBs are the backbone of this digital economy, right? I think we have between 40 million and 80 million, if we count the informal sector, SMBs across the continent, servicing our population of 1.5 billion people across this continent. And so we really have to think about what is the opportunity for the majority when we're talking about the private sector, and the majority is the SMBs, and we strive to be aligned with the SMBs, and because where there's growth for the SMBs, there will ultimately be growth for companies like Google and the rest of us, right? And so I think the bigger question is, how does DTA become more relevant to SMBs? How do we leverage technology to bring more SMBs online? How do we raise awareness and raise their skills to make sure that they can expand their business and their market opportunities beyond their own borders, and to be able to then export to the United States as partners in trade and not just recipients of aid, which I think is the goal, right? We want to be investing in African countries. And so I think there we're still a little bit lacking. We have individual initiatives that are being taken in this regard. Google has programs. We have our AI Hustle Academy, we call it. It's an SMB boot camp specifically dedicated to providing digital skills for SMBs. We have a startup accelerator program that is meant to accompany startup founders and help them to attract more investment to the continent. But I think what we're seeing is this sort of concentration of investment into those core countries that I mentioned where Google is present, right? The Nigerias, Kenya, South Africa, and what we need now is more diversification in terms of where the funding is going to other countries like Togo, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and how do we make sure that others are also benefiting from the growth that these digital economic strong players are bringing to the continent. And this is where we hope the AU, the African Union, will step up to create better opportunities for the rest of the continent and bring others along, right? So that digital protocol that Rob mentioned, I think is going to be critical. Having the document is phenomenal, and it's really groundbreaking because I don't think that we have this anywhere in the world yet, where with so many players anyways. So having 54, 55 member states agreeing to the terms of harmonized digital trade across the continent. They're now working on an emerging tech regulation that will look at what AI regulation should look like for the continent. I think that's really phenomenal. And then the next step will be, how do we implement it and operationalize these regulations that have been drafted? So we have a lot of potential that needs to be realized. The digital economic potential of the continent is like 712 billion by the year 2050. And we know that Africa's population, the youthful population, will be leading the voice of the world. 1 in 4 people in the entire world will be an African by 2050. And so what does that mean, right? How do we create opportunities for these young people? There won't be enough jobs. So we need to create greater employment through SMBs. How do we empower them with the skills that they need so that they have opportunities on the continent and can create jobs that will sustain them and the continent? And so I think we have a lot of work to do. There's definitely room for growth with DTA in terms of making sure that it's more relevant to the masses and including them in the conversations. The larger institutions, the larger companies have been involved. I think there's more consolidation of some of the initiatives and some of the investments that can be done, right? Otherwise, we're all individually working and seeking investments, which is fine. But I think if we are more intentional, then the outcomes can be more maximized. And this is the goal, right? To have larger impact on trade and on economic development, to do this at scale. And so that's going to require a little bit more effort, a little bit more time. It's still pretty early. And I'm confident and hopeful that it continues in that direction.
Well, thank you all. We are at time. This is fascinating. I learned so much. I hope we can come back in a year and see how things are still going. So thank you, Jane, Rob, Pren-Tsilya. Really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for taking your time to participate and listen. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with production support from Astik Lasafi, Liam Austin, and Brian Dong. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.